When I decided to move into that house, I was seeking peace. After a tumultuous divorce that seemed to drain my energy, my life, and honestly, my sanity, all I wanted was a fresh start. The small town felt like the perfect place for that. Unlike any metropolis I had ever known, time there seemed to drag lazily, as if each second had its own slow and deliberate rhythm. The streets were quiet, dotted with old houses, some crumbling, and trees that seemed as ancient as the earth itself. The house I rented was a bit away from the town center, almost hidden among the trees. It was the kind of place many would call charming at first glance. I, however, found the term inappropriate. The house had an antiquated air, with large windows and high ceilings, and their old-fashioned landline phone in the hallway that I found particularly curious. One of those relics from the past, hanging on the wall like a forgotten memory of days gone by. I wondered why the phone was still there since no one used such devices anymore. And honestly, the thought of using it never crossed my mind. The first few days were normal. I began to establish a routine, waking up early, taking walks around the neighborhood, meeting some people, and at night, relaxing with a book or a movie. I wanted simplicity, and I was getting it. The silence of the house at night was especially soothing. The absence of urban noise made me believe that maybe, just maybe, here I could finally gather myself again. Perhaps I could even learn to enjoy my own company. But then, on the fifth day, the phone rang. It was the middle of the night, around 3 a.m. The jarring sound of the device pulled me from a deep sleep, and it took me a few seconds to understand what was happening. My first thought was confusion. No one had that number. I didn't even know what the number was. Who would use a landline to call me at this hour? When I got up to answer, the sound stopped abruptly after 3 rings. I stood still in the hallway, silence reclaiming its place. The house returned to being just a house, quiet and dark. I went back to bed, convinced it had been a mistake or some technical issue. The next night, the phone rang again, once more at 3 a.m. 3 rings, and then silence. A slight discomfort began to grow within me, like a small stone in my stomach. It made no sense. What would someone gain from this? I decided I wouldn't think too much about it and went back to sleep. But the rings repeated in the following nights, always at the same time. 3 rings. And then, silence. I started to become restless. The nights, once tranquil, turned into a terrain of expectation and tension. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the phone to ring, knowing it would come, knowing that when it did, it would be just a reminder that something was wrong. It was after a week that I met Mr. Walters. He lived 2 houses down from mine, an elderly and solitary man who often sat on his porch watching people pass by. He seemed friendly enough, and when I stopped to chat with him during one of my walks, he quickly began to tell me stories about the town. The conversation was light until he mentioned something about my house. His eyes took on a more serious and somber expression. He hesitated before speaking, as if carefully choosing his words. "You know, there's something, a rule, let's say," he said, his voice dropping a bit. "If the phone rings 3 times and no one answers, leave the house." I laughed, but he didn't laugh back. In that moment, I realized he was serious. I was speechless for a moment, and the discomfort that had been growing since the phone started ringing seemed to solidify inside me. That kind of story sounded like an absurd superstition, but something in Mr. Walters's gaze made me nervous. That night, I lay awake, waiting for the phone to ring, and it rang. 3 rings, just like always. But this time, I refused to answer. I stood still in the dark, feeling my heart race as the rings filled the house with an almost suffocating sound. After the phone stopped, I didn't fall back asleep. I began to pay more attention to the house. The cracks in the walls, which I had briefly noticed when I moved in, seemed to be expanding. In some places, it looked like the paint was starting to peel, revealing a darker color underneath. At first, I thought it was just wear and tear. But as the days passed, something bothered me. The house seemed to be changing, almost as if it were deteriorating before my eyes. During the day, I tried to distract myself, but at night, the silence returned to haunt me. It was no longer the calm silence of before. Now it felt heavy, suffocating. I began to hear strange noises, faint sounds that seemed to come from within the walls. I thought they could be rats or some other animals, but the noises were too sporadic and subtle to be typical movements. They felt more like whispers, as if someone was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. That's when the nightmares began. Every night, I dreamed of the phone. In my dreams, it rang incessantly, and I knew I had to answer. There was always a voice on the other end, weak, crying, pleading for help, but I could never understand what it was saying. I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the phone calls. By the 3rd week, I knew I needed answers. I couldn't continue in that house without understanding what was happening. Something told me that the key to it all was in the phone, but I still hesitated to dig deeper. I went to the local library and researched the history of the house. That's when I discovered about Caroline. She was the previous tenant, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. No one knew for sure what had happened to her, but the night she vanished was marked by a phone call. 3 rings, and no one answered. The connection between the past and the present began to haunt me. Whatever had happened in that house was somehow linked to those phone calls. After learning about Caroline at the library, my mind became restless. With each step I took in that house, it felt like something had subtly changed. It was as if the walls, the floors, even the air around me were watching, reacting to my thoughts. It wasn't just paranoia, or at least, that's what I tried to convince myself. Nights had become a battleground between my reason and a growing fear that seemed to defy logical explanation. That night, the phone rang again. 3 rings. Always 3 rings. This time, however, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the phone with a quick, almost desperate movement, pressing it to my ear. The silence on the other end was suffocating, a void that seemed to consume any trace of sound. I held the phone for a long time, waiting for something, anything, to fill that emptiness. When I hung up, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something told me that if I kept ignoring it, the situation would only get worse. Mr. Walters's warning echoed in my mind. If the phone rings 3 times and no one answers, leave the house. But I was answering, wasn't I? I was trying to understand, trying to decipher what was happening. The house, for some reason, didn't want me to understand. It was as if it were alive, hiding its secrets with a chilling coldness. I began to dream about Caroline. At first, they were just flashes, quick glimpses of a dark-haired woman standing next to the phone, a haunted expression on her face. Her eyes were always fixed on the phone, as if she were waiting for something, as if she knew that by answering, something terrible would happen. I woke up every time with my heart racing, trying to convince myself that they were just nightmares, echoes of the stories I'd read about the house. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was as if Caroline was trying to tell me something, but her words couldn't cross the chasm separating our worlds. I decided to speak with Mr. Walters again. The man seemed to know more than he was willing to share, and I needed to understand what was happening. When I arrived at his house, he looked surprised to see me, but he said nothing. He simply invited me in, as if he already knew the reason for my visit. "You know, don't you?" he asked after a long silence. His voice was rougher than I remembered, as if every word was a painful effort. "Know what?" I asked, trying to stay calm, even though the knot in my stomach tightened further. "About Caroline," he replied, avoiding my gaze. "She lived in that house, you know? Everyone knew something was wrong with her. Caroline was a good woman, but there was something unsettling about the way she lived. Always so quiet, always so distant." He paused, as if weighing whether to continue. "The phone? It started ringing, just like it is now, always at 3 a.m., 3 rings, and she would answer. At first, we thought it was just a coincidence, but over time, it became clear that something more was happening. Caroline became obsessed with those calls. She said there was someone or something trying to talk to her. And then, one night, she disappeared. Disappeared how? I asked, my voice sounding more nervous than I wanted. She just vanished. Left everything behind. The last thing we heard was the phone ringing that night. And then, nothing. No one ever saw her again. A chill ran down my spine. The story felt like it had come out of one of those horror books I read when I was younger. But there, in the house I lived in, it felt anything but fiction. "And no one investigated?" I asked, trying to find some logic. "The police? The neighbors? What was there to investigate?" He replied with a bitter smile. "She just vanished. No one saw anything. And who really wants to mess with something they don't understand? Some secrets should remain buried." That left me uneasy. I knew there was more to that story, but I also knew Walters wouldn't tell me everything. He was clearly hiding something, perhaps out of fear or guilt. In any case, I was determined to find out what really happened to Caroline. If the house had anything to do with her disappearance, I wasn't leaving until I found out. In the following nights, the phone kept ringing. By this point, I no longer expected to sleep. I sat on the bed, staring at the device on the wall, waiting for the 3 rings. When they came, my breath would catch for a moment, but I kept answering, always hoping that this time, someone would speak on the other end. But the silence persisted. The noises inside the walls also became more frequent. I used to hear faint sounds, as if something was slowly moving, scraping against the wooden boards. The noise was so subtle that if I hadn't been completely focused, I might have ignored it. But it was there, constant, like a breath that only I could hear. One day, while inspecting one of the cracks that seemed to grow larger each night, I felt something different. There was a kind of smell coming from the wall, a strong metallic odor mixed with something I couldn't identify. It was as if the walls of the house were hiding more than just cracks and dirt. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I stepped back, but something inside me was urging me to keep investigating. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a small knife, determined to scrape the wall and see what lay behind the peeling paint. As the blade cut through the surface, a small piece of paper detached from the crack. At first, I thought it was just an old newspaper used to fill a hole, but when I unfolded it, I realized it was a handwritten note. The letters were smudged and almost faded, but I could make out a few words. It wasn't an accident. My hands trembled. It couldn't be possible. That piece of paper had to have been there for decades, trapped in the wall. But what did it mean? It wasn't an accident? What was Caroline trying to tell me? That night, I couldn't sleep. The phone rang again, and I knew that this time I was closer to understanding. But fear grew with each moment I remained in that house. It wasn't just the phone calls. It wasn't just the nightmares. It was something deeper. It was the house itself, as if its walls were alive, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. I began to wonder if perhaps Mr. Walters was right. Maybe I should leave the house. Maybe I was playing with forces I shouldn't try to understand. But at the same time, something kept me there. Something I couldn't ignore. I had to know what really happened to Caroline. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of fatigue that went beyond lack of sleep. It felt as if the house was draining my energy, sapping my will to continue. Yet a part of me refused to give up. There was something I needed to understand, something that remained hidden, and I felt I was just a step away from discovering it. With each ring of the phone, with each strange noise echoing through the walls, I knew I was getting closer to a truth that no one else could see. However, this feeling of closeness was accompanied by a growing discomfort. My dreams of Caroline had become increasingly vivid, and now I could see her clearly, as if she were right beside me in the room. In my dreams, she was always near the phone, looking at it with a mix of fear and resignation. Sometimes she would look directly at me, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but no words would come out. I would wake up to the muffled sound of her voice still echoing in my ears, even though I couldn't understand what she was saying. The days passed slowly, and the nights became a true torment. No matter what I did, the phone continued to ring at 3 a.m., and the 3 rings echoed like an unavoidable sentence. I wondered what might have happened if Caroline had heeded Mr. Walters' warning and left the house. Would she still be alive, or was the house keeping her from escaping, just as it seemed to be doing with me now? It was during one of those nights that everything began to crumble. I was lying in bed, staring intently at the phone, waiting for the rings that had become part of my routine. The noises in the walls were growing louder, as if something was trying to move between the floorboards, but I tried to ignore them. When the phone finally rang, I answered without hesitation. The silence on the other end was expected, but this time, something different happened. As I held the receiver, I felt a presence behind me. It wasn't just a vague sensation. It was something palpable, as if someone was slowly approaching. My body tensed, and I turned my head slowly, not really wanting to see what was there. The room felt darker than usual, shadows stretching across the walls, and for a moment I was sure I saw a figure standing in the doorway. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, and deep down, I knew I wouldn't get an answer. The shadows seemed to move on their own, dancing on the walls as if they were alive. But when I turned the light on, there was nothing there. The phone slipped from my hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. My heart raced, and a part of me began to question my sanity. Was it possible I was imagining all of this? Had the isolation, the stress of the divorce, and the move to a house so full of sinister stories finally pushed me over the edge? But at the same time, there was something so real, so tangible in what I was experiencing that I couldn't simply dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. The next day, I decided I needed to do something. The feeling that the house was somehow alive, manipulating my perception, was too strong to ignore. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but staying there without answers felt increasingly unbearable. I went into town and, aimlessly wandering, entered an antique shop I had seen a few times while walking. The shop was small but filled with old items, each with its own story. Or so the owner, a white-haired man who looked older than any object inside, told me. I wandered among the shelves, not really paying attention to anything, until I found something that caught my eye. An old photo album, dusty and worn by time. I opened the album, flipping through the yellowed pages until I found a photo that made my stomach churn. It was Caroline. In the picture, she was standing next to the house that was now mine, smiling, with the old phone hanging on the wall in the background. The image was from a time long before the house fell into disrepair, but the phone, it was the same one that now hung in my hallway. A wave of cold washed over me, and without thinking twice, I bought the album and returned home. I spent the rest of the afternoon studying those photos, trying to find any clue that might help me understand what was happening. There were several pictures of Caroline in the house, some showing her with friends and family, but as the album progressed, the photos became increasingly solitary. The last images were just of Caroline, always inside the house, always with the same vacant look I had seen in my dreams. The phone rang again that night, as always, but this time something different happened. When I answered, instead of the usual silence, I heard a faint breathing, almost imperceptible. My entire body tensed, and fear took hold of me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I wanted. The silence returned, but the breathing continued, growing heavier and closer, as if someone on the other end was about to say something I didn't want to hear. I hung up the phone with such force that I nearly broke the device. Whatever was happening was escalating, and at that moment, I knew I had to do something before it was too late. I went to see Mr. Walters again, unsure of what to ask or say. When he opened the door, he looked more tired than the last time. His expression was a mix of pity and fatigue, as if he knew exactly what I was about to ask. "You shouldn't be in that house anymore," was the first thing he said. "Caroline, she tried to warn you, just like she tried to warn all of us." "What's happening, Mr. Walters? What happened to Caroline?" My voice came out more firmly than I expected, but the fear I felt was palpable. He took a deep breath, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Caroline knew that the house was not like the others. After she started receiving the calls, something changed in her. She became obsessed. She said someone was trying to talk to her, that the phone was the key to understanding what had happened, but she never managed to figure it out. And then, she disappeared." His words hit me like a punch. The story felt absurdly familiar. "You think I should leave, right?" I asked, more to myself than to him. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "You still have a chance, but if you stay, the house won't let you go." That night, I returned home determined to find answers. The cracks in the walls were more pronounced, and the metallic smell I had noticed earlier was stronger. Each step I took echoed through the empty house, and the shadows seemed to move as I approached the phone. I knew I was running out of time. At 3 a.m., the phone rang. This time, I knew I couldn't just answer and wait for silence. I picked up the receiver and said, in the firmest voice I could muster, "What do you want?" There was a long pause, but the breathing returned, heavy and suffocating. And then, a weak voice, almost indistinguishable, said something that chilled me to the bone. "She is here. She has always been." The call was cut off, but the terror that phrase brought lingered. "She is here." Caroline, or whoever it was still in that house, trapped in some way. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to heed Walter's advice and never look back. But another part, the part that had kept me there until now, wanted to understand. There was something in that house, something deeper than I could comprehend, and somehow, I was entangled in it now. What would happen if I ignored Mr. Walters' warning? The night I heard that voice was the last time I felt truly in control of the situation. "She is here. She has always been." The words reverberated in my mind like a sentence. Something had changed, and I knew that from that moment on, I would never be the same. The house had captured me, and it wasn't just physically. It felt as though I was bound to it in a way I couldn't fully understand. Something far beyond the walls, the cracks, or the incessant calls. The air inside the house felt heavy, as if something was accumulating. Each breath seemed harder, each step slower, as if I were walking through a nightmare. During the day, the light coming through the windows was weak and opaque. Even when the sun was high outside, it was as if the house itself was suffocating the light, filtering the outside world until nothing remained but emptiness and silence. In the days that followed that last call, my routine was completely shattered. I found myself stopping in front of the phone several times a day, waiting for it to ring, hoping for some new revelation, a next step, a clue that would pull me out of that state of limbo. But during the day, the phone remained silent, as if it knew exactly when to ring and when to leave me in peace, just enough to keep me teetering between sanity and madness. My nights, however, told a different story. Sleep had become a lost battle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caroline. She was there, standing next to the phone, as always. But over time, something in her had changed. The serene face now appeared distorted, her features becoming vague, as if she were disintegrating. With each new dream she became less recognizable, until her face was little more than a shadow of pain and despair. The house also seemed to be moving. Not literally, but in the way I perceived it. The layout was the same. The furniture remained in the same places, but there was something subtly different each day. A chair seemed to have moved by itself. A door that I knew I had left closed was now open. Small changes that could not be explained by carelessness. Yet, I tried to rationalize everything. Part of me desperately clung to the idea that there was a logical explanation. Maybe it was my exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe it was my mind, tired of so much fear, trying to find something to justify the inexplicable. I decided I couldn't continue like this. I needed to take action. Leave the house? Maybe. But before making any decisions, I knew I needed to fully understand what was happening. There was a mystery there. Something involving Caroline, the phone, and somehow involving me as well. I needed more answers before surrendering to fear. That's when I had the idea to investigate the basement. Since moving into the house, I had avoided that part, as if an instinctive part of me knew I shouldn't go down there. But now, there was no other choice. If there was any place where the secrets of the house were hidden, it was there. I grabbed a flashlight, which somehow felt insufficient against the thick darkness emanating from the stairs leading to the basement. I hesitated for a moment at the top of the stairs, listening to the muffled sound of the wind outside, before finally descending. The smell of mold was strong, saturating the air with dampness and decay. The floor was cold beneath my feet, and each step I took echoed against the walls, as if the basement was expanding in all directions. The flashlight swayed in my hand, revealing elongated shadows that moved in sync with the beam of light. I kept my focus on the ground in front of me, not wanting to think about what might be moving in the shadows around me. Upon reaching the bottom of the stairs, I came across an old wooden door, its surface marked by decades of wear. The doorknob was cold and rusty, and when I turned it, it gave way with a loud creak that seemed to resonate throughout the basement. As the door opened, I felt a wave of cold air envelop me, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The room beyond the door was small, almost claustrophobic, with damp, dirty stone walls. But what caught my attention most was what lay in the center of the room. A table covered in papers, all yellowed and torn, as if they had been left there long ago. I approached hesitantly and began to sift through the papers. They were notes, disorganized scrawls written in hurried and confused handwriting, disconnected words, interrupted phrases. But upon closer examination, I saw the name Caroline repeated several times. One phrase in particular caught my eye. She knew too much. The phone. The key is in the phone. At that moment, I felt a chilling shiver run down my spine. Caroline had been trying to understand something that had consumed her, just as it was happening to me. Suddenly, something moved in the corner of my vision. A quick motion, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me recoil, knocking the pile of papers to the floor. The beam of the flashlight swayed, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the shadows. A figure, perhaps. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that the atmosphere had changed drastically. The air was heavier, as if something was watching me. I was not alone there. I swallowed the rising panic and hurried out of the basement as quickly as I could. My hands were trembling as I locked the door behind me, as if that would prevent anything from following me out. But the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. I climbed the stairs, and when I returned to the main floor, I noticed something even more disturbing. The phone was off the hook. I knew I had left it on the hook before descending to the basement. There was no doubt, but now it hung, swaying slightly, as if someone had just used it. My heart began to pound in my chest. It was impossible for anyone else to be in the house. I locked all the doors and windows religiously. So who had touched the phone? I picked up the receiver hesitantly, expecting to hear the same silence as always. But this time, something was different. The sound of breathing was back, heavier, closer. My fingers went numb as I gripped the phone. "Who are you?" My voice trembled, almost pleading. Again, the same weak, almost whispering voice spoke. "She is here. She is waiting." The connection cut off before I could react, and the sound of the phone smashing against the wall echoed through the room. My legs gave way, and I sank to the floor, staring at the phone as if it were a living creature. The house was enveloping me, trapping me, and with every touch, every breath, from the other side of the line, I felt the separation between the world of the living and the dead growing ever thinner. I knew Caroline had disappeared. I knew her obsession with the phone and the mysterious calls had led her to a dark fate. And now somehow, the story was repeating itself. I was where she had been, hearing the same voices, following the same path. That night, as the clock approached 3 a.m., I made a decision I knew I couldn't take back. If Caroline was trapped in that place, I needed to confront her, or whatever it was that was holding me in that house. When the phone rang one last time, I didn't hesitate. I answered on the first ring. "I'm here," I said, my voice coming out with a determination I didn't know I had. The line fell silent for a few seconds, and then the weak, familiar voice spoke again, but this time with more clarity. "You shouldn't have stayed." The breathing stopped on the other end. The house fell into absolute silence. I let the phone drop to the floor, feeling an overwhelming weight on my chest. The air was still, dense, and I knew something was about to happen. Something I couldn't prevent. With one last glance at the phone, I turned to the door. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. And then I realized I would never leave that house. Just like Caroline, I was now a part of it.